Look, I don't think it's a very bold claim to say that 2,500 years ago, women were thought of a little differently than they are today. You know, get married as a teen, take care of your husband and children, and don't even think of initiating a conversation with a man who is not your husband. So, when we look at some of the major characters throughout the Bible, it shouldn't come as a shock to anyone that most of them will be men. Noah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, Solomon, Peter, Paul, and the main character, the fully God, fully man himself, Jesus incarnate. But let's not get it twisted. God didn't only use men to fulfill his will. Today we're going to talk about one woman who God used in a major way to potentially save the Jewish people and affect mankind forever. This is the woman in Songs of Solomon. No, just kidding. Just messing, guys. Just messing. This is the story of Esther. So the story of Esther takes place during the reign of King Xerxes in about 470 BC. But to see how we got here, we have to go back about 600 years to the book of 1 Samuel when the people of Israel were demanding to have a king so they could be taken seriously as a nation. Samuel tried to warn them against this, but the people were relentless, so Saul became the first king of Israel. And over the next 500 years, the kings would turn their back on the Lord time and time again, with very few exceptions, leading their people into idolatry. Yet the Lord gave them chance after chance until one day around 597 BC, he used the nation of Babylon to destroy the city of Jerusalem and exile the people of Israel. The people became servants to the king of Persia for about 60 years until God led the king to let them return to their land. So some of the Israelites returned to Jerusalem and some of the Israelites stayed in Persia. This leads us up to the reign of King Xerxes. Now that we're all caught up, let the story begin. Chapter 1 begins in the third year of King Xerxes' reign, and to celebrate the success and prosperity of his empire, he gathered all the military officers and media members of Persia, as well as the princes and nobles from all 127 provinces he ruled over, and he threw a banquet that lasted 180 days straight. Goodness gracious, could you imagine partying for 6 months? Then, after the banquet was over, the king decided to throw a 7-day celebration for everyone in the fortress of Susa, no matter their position or stature. There was an abundance of wine, and the limit on drinking was abolished for the week. There were gold and silver couches on mosaic pavement, purple ribbons on marble pillars. The courtyard was decorated beautifully for the celebration of abundance. And at the same time this celebration was taking place, the king's wife, Queen Vashti, was having her own celebration for all the women of Susa in King Xerxes' royal palace. So a nation of people who did not serve the Lord partying for a week straight with no alcohol limit? Lord help them. On the final day of the week-long feast, King Xerxes had a few too many glasses of wine, and he wanted all the nobles in the land to see how beautiful his woman was, so he sent 7 eunuchs to go get Queen Vashti. However, the queen had her own celebration going on, and she refused to come. As you can imagine, this made the king furious, so he gets his council together, the 7 men with the highest status in the empire, to ask for advice on what to do about Queen Vashti. One of the men spoke up, suggesting that the queen's actions were unacceptable and this will surely start a movement of wives disrespecting their husbands all over the nation. I would hate to see this guy's reaction to She-Hulk. No, I'm just kidding. But he suggested that the king make an unreversible decree to banish Queen Vashti from his presence forever and to find a new queen. This will surely make wives respect their husbands all over the empire. Okay, I guess. So the king thought this made sense and sent the proclamation out that every man should be the ruler of his home and should say whatever he pleases. This should be fun. Verse 1 of the second chapter is a perfect example of why we should never ever make a decision out of anger or any other emotion for that matter. See, the king had finally calmed down and was looking back at the decree he had made and about Vashti in general. Don't worry, bro, we've all been there. Then before he can reflect too much, his attendants suggest gathering all the beautiful young women in the empire so he can find a new queen. This made the king happy, so he put the plan into effect. This is when we are introduced to Mordecai, a Jewish man in the fortress whose family were among those exiled by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, why is Mordecai important? Well, Mordecai had a cousin whose parents had died and he had raised her as his own daughter. Her name was Hadassah and she was a beautiful young woman who would be one of the women chosen to be brought before King Xerxes. Oh yeah, and Hadassah also went by another name. Mordecai's cousin was none other than Esther. So Esther and the other women were brought to the fortress of Susa. A man named Haggai took care of her and ordered her special beauty treatments. Mordecai had also warned Esther not to tell anyone about her Jewish nationality, so she kept it a secret. He took a walk in the courtyard every day to keep up with Esther and see how things were going. And so just a heads up, this is where things get a little PG-13. If you were wondering how the beauty contest worked, the young women had to go through 12 months of beauty treatments before they were allowed to see the king. 6 months of bathing in oil and myrrh, and 6 months of being covered in perfumes and ointments. Then, after she had been Febrezed to death for a year, the night she was set to meet the king, she could choose any articles of clothing she wanted, and then was brought to the king's palace to have sex with him. I'm sorry, but if I were the king, I wouldn't even be able to focus after a year full of perfumes and oils. Anyway, the king would sleep with these women, and if he was satisfied, they would become his concubines. then sent off to live in the palace and not allowed to have any contact with the king unless he wanted to sleep with her again. Wow. So Esther spent a year preparing to please the king, and when the day finally arrived, she wore nothing more than what the king suggested and was taken to the royal palace. And this is where God took a disgusting, lustful situation and still used it to fulfill his will. King Xerxes loved Esther more than any of the other women and was so delighted by her, he chose her as the new queen to replace Vashti. He even threw a banquet to honor Queen Esther and celebrated by declaring a public holiday and giving out many gifts. Then time went on and all the other young women became concubines, and Mordecai had moved up in rank to become a palace official. So one night Mordecai overheard two eunuchs planning on assassinating King Xerxes. Mordecai overheard, informed Esther, who then told the king and gave Mordecai credit. The king impaled the two assassins on sharp poles after finding out Mordecai's report was true. The king loved both Esther and Mordecai, but Esther still had to keep her nationality a secret. After a little time had passed, a man named Haman found favor with the king, so Xerxes appointed him as the most powerful official of the empire. When he would walk the streets, the people would bow as a sign of respect. That is, except for one man, Mordecai. The palace officials started asking him day by day why he wouldn't bow and told him he must start showing respect. But Mordecai stayed faithful to the Lord, and he revealed he wouldn't bow because he was a Jew. Mordecai had finally revealed his nationality, and when Haman heard about this, he was furious. But punishing Mordecai himself wouldn't be enough. So he went to King Xerxes with a plan to eliminate all Jews throughout the empire. Haman persuaded the king by telling him that a group of people called Jews don't respect him and only follow their own laws. He then offered a donation of 10,000 large sacks of silver, and if you want a conversion, that's $226,291,702.50 in today's money to the royal treasury if the king passed this decree. So Xerxes passed a declaration that on March 7th the following year, all the Jews must be slaughtered on a single day. He then marked this with a seal of his ring and sent this out to all the nations throughout the land. Major side note, him sealing this decree with his ring means that this ruling is unreversible. So in nearly a year's time, this will be a full day where all the Gentiles were commanded to slaughter anyone Jewish. And anyone who killed a Jew would be rewarded any property that they owned. So the decree was sent out, and Haman and the king sat down for a drink, but the city was left in confusion. When Mordecai heard about what had just taken place and the law that had been passed, he tore his clothes and went near the palace to publicly mourn. It wasn't just Mordecai either. As the news of this decree spread, Jews all over the nation mourned, fasted, and wept, including Esther when she heard about her uncle mourning. She sent the eunuch to go get him to see what had him so sad, for she hadn't heard about the law yet. Mordecai explained to Hatak the eunuch what Haman had done and showed him the decree. He asked Hatak to show Esther and see if she would beg the king to save her people. So he returned to Esther and gave her Mordecai's message. Once Esther heard about what was going on, she had a message in response to her uncle. She told him that everyone in the land knows if you appear before the king, uninvited, you are doomed to die. Basically, sorry, Unc, but I'm not signing my own death wish. And that's when Mordecai had to reply to Esther with a reality check in verse 13. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. He then explains if she keeps quiet, God will deliver the Jewish people some other way, but she will surely die. And he ends with my favorite line in the whole book. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just a time as this? This must have opened Esther's eyes because her reply to Mordecai was nothing less than heroic. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and my maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. See, Esther understood that the Lord placed her in a position to fulfill his will and save the chosen people. So she accepted the response and was ready to put her life on the line to do so. If that isn't the definition of a role model, I don't know what is, to be honest. We should all strive to fulfill the will of our Lord and Savior. On the third day of all the Jews in Susa fasting, Esther put on her robe of bravery and went to see the king. When he saw her approach, he held out his gold scepter to her, meaning she had permission to enter and speak with him. The king clearly adored her because the first thing he told Esther was to grant any request and it was hers. She simply requested that he and Haman come to a banquet she prepared, so King Xerxes ran and got Haman to attend Esther's banquet with him. So they were all at the dinner, and the king asked Esther again, "Now tell me what it is you really want." Esther said, "Okay, if you and Haman join me again tomorrow for another banquet, I'll tell you." They agreed, and as Haman was leaving, he ran into Mordecai, who still refused to bow to him. This made Haman furious, so he gathered his wife and friends, firstly to brag about his position and the banquet that he would be attending with the king and queen tomorrow, but secondly to complain about Mordecai. So his friend suggested he set up a 75-foot tall sharp pole and have Mordecai impaled on it upon the king's approval. See, back then, the height of the object of impalement was a symbol of the severity of the punishment. So Haman loved the sound of this and ordered the pole to be set up before even speaking with the king. Something tells me this wasn't the sharpest idea. Get it? Because the pole. Yeah, okay. That same night, the king had trouble sleeping. So, like any normal king, he started reading the book of the history of his reign. Me personally, I just watched Danny DeVito Jersey Mike's commercials, and that puts me right out. Now, as Xerxes is reading, he came across the record of when Mordecai saved his life from the two assassins. He asked his attendants how Mordecai had been rewarded for this, and they informed him that he hadn't been. Just that time, Haman appears, coming to request that Mordecai be impaled on a pole. But before he can say anything, the king asks, "What should I do to honor a man that truly pleases me?" Haman, of course, thought he was talking about him, so he goes on how he should be given the king's royal robe and a horse that the king himself had ridden so he could march through the city as someone shouts, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." So Xerxes said, "Sounds great. Now go get Mordecai and do just this." Sometimes God has the greatest sense of humor, I swear. So instead of Haman impaling Mordecai, he now was walking him through the town yelling, "This is what the king does for someone he honors." After the parade, Mordecai simply returned to the gate, but Haman was completely humiliated. He told his friends about what had happened, and it seems like they finally came to a realization. They told Haman, "Because Mordecai is Jewish, you will never defeat him. In fact, continuing to go against him will be fatal." This reminds me of one of my favorite verses, Isaiah 54:17. "But in that coming day, no weapon turned against you will succeed. You will silence every voice raised up to accuse you. These benefits are enjoyed by the servants of the Lord. Their vindication will come for me. I, the Lord, have spoken." So as they were still talking, the eunuchs arrived and took Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So Haman and the king went to Esther's banquet. They began eating and drinking, and the king tells Esther a second time, "Tell me what it is you really want, Esther. Even if it's half the kingdom, I'll give it to you." This is when Esther finally reveals that she is a Jew and asks the king to spare her people who Haman is trying to slaughter. The king was so filled with rage he had to take a step outside, while Haman stayed back to plead Esther to spare his life. He was so distressed he fell into the couch Esther was laying on, and, well, this was the worst possible time because King Xerxes walks back in, sees Haman on the couch with Esther, and says, "What, are you going to assault her right now too?" So the king's attendants grabbed Haman and told the king about the pole he had made to impale Mordecai on. And have you ever heard the phrase, "you reap what you sow"? Well, Haman was about to learn what it meant really quick because Xerxes ordered them to impale Haman on that pole instead. So let's just say we never heard from Haman again. The same day Haman was killed, the king awarded Esther all of his property. She had also finally told the king how her and Mordecai were related, so they appointed him in charge of this property, as well as given him the signet ring that Haman previously held. So Esther begged Xerxes to undo the decree that Haman had made to slaughter the Jews in a single day, but that's when the king told Esther and Mordecai, whatever has already been written and signed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. However, he told them to write a new decree and sign it with the ring he gave them. So on June 25th, Mordecai wrote a proclamation to everyone in the 127 provinces that next year on March 7th, all Jewish people will have the authority to defend themselves. He wrote that they should annihilate anyone that threatens to hurt their families, and afterwards their property will be theirs. This decree was signed with the king's ring and sent out quickly by messengers to all the people in the land. This caused great joy among the Jewish people, and many festivals were thrown after hearing this news. Even a lot of people converted to Judaism after hearing all that had happened. God once again used a terrible situation to lead more souls to Him. So it was finally March 7th, the day both decrees became effective. The enemies of the Jews tried to overpower them, but God was with His people, and the Jews defended their families. They overpowered their enemies and ended up killing 75,000 of those who hated them. They defeated 800 enemies in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. They refused to take any plunder, and the next day all the Jewish nation rested with a feast of honor and celebration. Mordecai recorded everything that happened and sent letters to instruct Jews to remember this victory by creating an annual festival on March 8th and 9th for years to come. This festival would consist of feasting and giving gifts to the poor in honor of the joy they felt on this day. They decided to name this festival Purim because this was an ancient word for casting lots, the method Haman used to originally determine March 7th as the date of genocide. So the festival of Purim was celebrated for generations to come, and the memory of what the Lord did for them would never fade away. Esther herself even wrote a letter giving her full authority to establish the festival, and we cannot forget that this celebration wouldn't be happening without her bravery to confront the king. The story ends with King Xerxes imposing a tribute to all the people in the land, as well as making Mordecai the prime minister. He had full authority next to the king, which meant he could continually speak up for the Lord's people and have a voice to defend them. This just shows that God will never leave his people stranded and always have a perfect ending to every story. So, what did you guys think of the story of Esther? It always stood out to me that God used the bravery of one woman to fulfill his will and save the Jewish people. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I want everyone to know that it is never too late to give your life to the Lord and accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. He's waiting with open arms and is ready for his child to come back home. If you have any questions, as always, our email is in the description, and I hope everyone watching has an amazing day. God bless and peace.